So in today's web dev tip, we're going to be carrying on with our Rick and Roll end-to-end project, and we're actually in this tutorial going to link up some JavaScript or TypeScript code in our case to the button that we created in yesterday's tutorial. So if you remember where we left our actual site yesterday, we created a strapline and a button here that we can click, but obviously clicking it doesn't do anything at the moment. So we're going to set up our project now to add an event listener to this button, so when someone clicks it, we can actually generate a short URL. So it's going to be a little bit less on the design side and the creation of the site in this tutorial. We're just going to do the actual code to set up the event listener, and then in the next tutorial what we'll actually do is, with the result from the API call that we're going to be making, we'll put the details to the user on the page. Okay, so with our NX setup, we created this web project, and as mentioned a few times in the previous videos, this is actually using web components, or you've got the ability to use web components at least. So we're importing this app.element.ts, so we could go and create some web components at this point, but it'll work just as well for our use case to create some pure TypeScript code, which obviously gets transpiled down to JavaScript and loaded into the browser, and just use that to set up our event listener, because we're not doing anything too technical on the front end, at least at the moment. So we'll just remove that imported web component from here, and one of the benefits of using NX is that all of this transpilation and bundling of the code is automatically done for you. So if I just, for example, put a console.log in here and just say up and running, for example, and if I save that, the app will recompile. And if we go down into the browser and look in the console, you can see here, or you may be able to see here if I zoom in a bit, there's a message there that we just logged out to the console coming from our main.ts file. So that is super useful because we don't need to worry about importing any script tags or anything like that. The NX ecosystem will handle all of that bundling for us, so we can just go ahead and write some TypeScript code into this main.ts file. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually select the button from the page that we've generating, and then we're going to set up an event listener for that, which in turn will then call the API. So this is our backend API that's running locally, but when we push it to production, it will actually use the API that's running on our DigitalOcean server. So we just need to select that element, and the way we left the markup yesterday, we've got a class of strapline which encompasses the H2 and the button. I will just give the button a specific ID. We might as well, it just makes it easier to select it. So it'll just say action button, for example. Let's save that. So now it's got a specific ID, we can easily select it within our code. So first things to do is we're going to set up a constant variable which will reference that ID. So we'll say action btn, for example. I realise I'm mixing camel case and snake case here as well. That's probably not a good habit to get into, so we'll keep them the same. It'll just make life easier when we're referring to the same thing. So document.getElement by ID. You can also use query selector as well, and we want to get the element with the ID of action button. So now in our code we've got a reference to that. We can use it throughout the rest of this file, and what we want to do is say for the action button, we want to add an event listener. What's the event we're listening for? Well, it's the click event, and from there we want to run some code. You can grab the event object if you just pass it into the arguments here for the anonymous function in the callback. I can't think of a good reason why we would want the event object at this point, so we'll just leave that empty. So just as a test to see that this is all working okay, we'll just log out a message to the console. So we'll say console.log button clicked. What we'll find if we go over to the browser, we should see our button here somewhere. There it is. It should have that right ID, and if we click it, we can see in the Chrome DevTools in the console, we're getting button clicked. So I'm not sure exactly where NX will put the code in terms of where the JavaScript will be loaded, as in, is it loaded before the document is completed loaded, or is it something that might be loaded before all of the elements are on the page? So what we could do, just to kind of be on the safe side, is to say window.onload. So once the window is loaded, we'll run this function, and we're just going to wrap all of our code inside of here. Okay, but the same thing will happen if we go and click the button. We should see that the button clicked message appears, but we'll just be playing it safe just to ensure that everything is loaded before we try and set up that event listener. Okay, but we don't just want to display a message in the console, we actually want to do something as well. What do we want to do? We want to actually send the network request, as we have been doing in Postman up until this point, to the backend API to generate the short URL. So we're going to do that with fetch in the browser here. You can load in any third-party network software as well. And again, another benefit of using the mono repo approach is if you add a package like Axios, for example, you can use that on your backend services and also in the front-end service as well, and you don't need to install it twice. But we'll keep it simple for this tutorial. We'll just use the fetch API, which should be available in the browser. So once we've clicked that button, we just need to send a fetch request, and then we'll be able to hook into the then properties and also catch if there are any errors. So what do we actually need to pass into this fetch function? Well, you should be able to see here that we've got two arguments that we need to provide, and it's mainly just the URL and any options that you're sending as well. So first of all, the URL is pretty simple. We would just be sending it to HTTP localhost 333, and I think we left the API set up to short URL. The only problem with this is it will work locally, but then when we actually push it up to our production service, to the DigitalOcean server, it will still be pointing at localhost, but that'll be no good because it'll be referring to the local host of whoever is actually accessing the site. So we'll need to ensure this is done via an environment variable. So what we can do is just cut this from the code that we've got here. And in our project, our web project, we should still have an environments file. And we saw this in the API where we had the different URLs. So in here, we can create new environment variables, which will be bundled into our code. So we could put something in here saying API URL, for example, and it's just, again, localhost 3333. And we could just leave it like that. And what we'll do in the actual front-end code is we'll append short URL to the string, because what we can now do is if we copy and paste this into our production environment, we'll say the API URL is not that, it's going to be HTTP, and it's, wait one second, it's rickandroll.me /API is where the API lives. So don't worry about the production environment too much at the moment. We'll come back and get that set up when we actually go to push this live. But just so you know that we've got an environment variable here for API URL, which we can now replace inside of here. So let's create a template literal, and we'll say environment dot API URL, and then it's /short URL. Okay, so that will send the request to the API to short URL, and all we're going to do in this tutorial is just log that out to the console, and then in the next tutorials we'll actually add this into the page, and if there are any errors, we'll just console those out for the moment too as well. Okay, so we'll save that. The code is there now. If we go and run it though, we should see there's a bit of a problem. So if we click the button, you can see here we're trying to make a GET request to start off with, but the first problem is that the API is not up and running. So it's obviously been killed at some point in when I've been switching between tutorials. So what we can do is we can just get that back up and running by running the nx command. So nx run, and it's going to be for rickandroll, which is the project name we gave to the API, and we'll just say serve. Okay, and you can see some output on the console there saying we're connected to the database server, so that's good, we're all up and running. So let's just click that again. So now we can see that we're actually trying to make the request, but it's still failing, and that is because we're getting a cause error. So the API itself is set up to not accept requests from other origins, so we're making a request from the browser at the moment, and it won't actually accept that, so we're going to fix that in the next tutorial, but we still need to make another change to our fetch request, and that is that we're actually still making a GET request, and if you remember from our API, we need to send a POST request. So we can update that in our fetch code just by passing in another object here. Okay, and the object, there's different properties we can set there, but the thing we need to change is the method. So we've got the method available here. We can set it as GET, patch, put, or in our case, we want to set it as POST. So if we just save that and click the button one more time in the browser, what we should find is this line here. If you can see that on the screen, we are now indeed making a POST request to the right URL, but it is still failing because of that cause error. So we're going to leave it here for this tutorial. Just wanted to show you how to get the request set up and obviously linked to the button. In the next tutorial, we're going to fix that cause problem, and then hopefully you'll see that the request is going through and we're getting the data back from the API as well. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.